Today's speaker is Tayden Bundy. Tayden was born and raised in Lincoln and graduated from UNL with a degree in English and History. In the spirit of Halloween, Tayden's lecture explores his fascination with how ghost stories are passed down and modified from generation to generation. In his recent book, Beyond Lincoln, A History of Nebraska Hauntings, Tayden explores stories by combining historical records and geographical documentation centered on paranormal activity in Lincoln, Nebraska. And as an added bonus, Tayden will be signing copies of his book out in the museum store right after his presentation today. So please help me welcoming Tayden Bundy.
Hello, everyone. This is a nice turnout. I'm very nervous, if you can't tell, but I'm going to just kind of flow with it and see what happens. As I was introduced, my name is Tayden Bundy, and I wrote Beyond Lincoln, A History of Nebraska Hauntings. I love ghost stories. I have been intrigued by them since I was a child. And I started thinking about ghosts and how those stories evolve and change over time, and that brought me to my book. And so my book is about ghost stories, but it's also about the history behind them, where they come from, how they start, why we keep telling them, why they're so important to our communities, and how they build relationships with each other. Because we tell these spooky tales to each other, to kids, to sort of freak them out a lot of times, but we also tell them to each other for fun. And we tell them to each other to create history about our own towns and our own cities. And so I wrote 10 chapters for this particular book, and I chose, originally I was only going to do stories from Lincoln. And then I decided that I was also going to include some from outside of Lincoln because I knew the Lincoln stories, but as I was researching, I realized that there were so many other great stories in Nebraska that had great history behind them. So I ended up choosing 6 from Lincoln and then 4 more from outside of Lincoln that I actually included in the book. And the stories that I chose were ones that I felt have intriguing histories to share. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to tell you some ghost stories, some spooky tales from Nebraska, but then I'm also going to delve into the history behind them, some of the more gruesome details of the things that have happened here in Nebraska. But as a child, I was so fascinated with ghosts. And the person that I remember the most who came and spoke to us at my school in middle school, his name was Dwayne Hutchinson. And he came and he had a book that he wrote about ghost stories. And I believe at this point, at this time period, he's no longer around. But at this time period, he has 4 that are still being sold throughout Nebraska. And throughout anywhere, I suppose. I mean, with the internet now, you can get anything. But he came to our school and he told this incredible story about the C.C. White building. And I remember as a child, I was so captivated by his storytelling. And I remember that I was so captivated by this story. And I'm sure he told other stories that day, but I was in love with this story about the C.C. White building. And the story goes that in October of 1963, a woman by the name of Colleen Butterbaugh was in Old Main building on Wesleyan campus. And across from from the Old Main building was a building called the C.C. White building. And Dean Sam Dahl at the time, he asked Colleen to go across and find a professor who was visiting from Scotland and relay a message to him. It could have been anything, that there was a meeting later or that he wanted to talk to him. But so she went over to the C.C. White building to find this professor. Well, when she got over there, the C.C. White building was a music building, arts building. There was lots of sounds. There's noise and music and students talking. Well, there's all this sound as she's going in, and as she walks further into the building to get to the area where the offices are, all the sound suddenly disappears. It's silent. And she looks forward, and in an area where there were cupboards, like cubbies, there's a woman standing there with her back to her. And she's reaching up to get something out of these cubbies that held sheet music. And she could tell from the person that it was a person, but that it wasn't a person. And that person was wearing clothing not from 1963. And all of a sudden, she also felt that there was someone to her left, like a male presence. That's how she described it. And when she looked, all the windows in the room were open. And she looked out to the left, and out through the window, it had gone back in time. There was no longer a sorority building there that had just been built. There was no, it was like Nebraska country back in the day. There's just nothing there. And there was no one standing next to her. So what does she do? Well, she screams and she runs out. So she runs out of the building. She runs towards the entrance. And as she's coming back, all the sound floods back. She starts hearing all this noise again, the music. And she goes back over to the old main building and she sits down and she gets ready, gets back to work, and she's very fidgety. And Dean Sam Dahl finally comes up to her and says, well, what's going on? Did you talk to this professor I asked you to talk to? And she's like, no, I had something weird happen to me over there. And so she tells the story to him. And he actually relays the story around campus to try to find out if they can figure out who that person was that she saw. And eventually it comes to be that there's another professor that thinks that she's talking about a woman named Clara Mills. Well, this woman named Urania Clara Mills, she worked in the CCY building. And she died in the CCY building in 1940. So this was 20-some years before. And the interesting thing is that Clara Mills didn't die in a weird way. She just happened to be coming into work. She was coming in. It was in April of 1940, and so it was still kind of chilly out. She was wearing a coat and gloves. She sat down at her desk. She was getting ready to get ready, and she just had a heart attack. So nothing crazy about it. Just she happened to die there. So the elements of this story are important. You have incredible things going on. And here is I actually went out to Wyuka to visit Clara Mills' grave. These stories are incredible. This story is incredible because you're getting all of these elements that are so important. Sound. She has all this sound and then all of a sudden it's gone. She can see an apparition in front of her in a different time period. Then she also can feel someone, and that's very typical of ghost stories. You have this sense that someone is watching you. It's an odd feeling. But then she also has time travel, which is just incredible. She can see a different time period, and she's in a different time period until she finally runs out and comes back to 1963. So when I started thinking about the story as an adult later on, after hearing the story as a child, I started thinking about all the elements that combine the story and how important they are, and how we tell these ghost stories and how they change, but they also have elements of truth behind them. So then that's where my book comes in. I started writing about these stories because they are stories about our town and about our past, but they're also fun ways to spook kids. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to tell you a few stories from my book, and I'm going to tell you about the history behind them. Some of the history is pretty gruesome, but with ghost stories, there's death. So that's what happens with these stories most of the time. So I'm going to start off by telling you about one of my favorites, which is the cold spot on 20th and Washington. Now, the ghost story goes that there's a prominent young man, and he's walking down the street, 20th and Washington, near 20th and Washington. And it's winter, it's cold, and it's getting dark, and it gets dark early, so there's not much light out. And it's at the turn of the 20th century. There's no one around, he's just walking, and all of a sudden a roadster drives down the street, coming up from where he was walking from, and it stops right next to him, and he has a conversation with the people in the car. And they start talking back and forth, and then all of a sudden, bang, he gets shot. And then bang, he's shot again. And as that second shot rings out, the car just speeds away. Well, the neighbors in the town start coming out, start flooding towards him. They hear the sounds. So they go out to him, and as he's on the ground, he's writhing in pain, and he can't speak. And in the blood that's on the concrete, he tries to spell out the name of the person who shot him. But before he can, he dies. Now, this story is incredible, right? There's so many elements to it. But then later on, I hear this other story that's very similar to this one, but now it's a young boy. It's a boy who's on the corner of 20th and Washington. And the person who drives by just shoots him there. And he does the same thing. He dies on the corner without being able to ever relay a message to the people who are trying to save him. Well, now today, people say that on the corner of 20th and Washington, one of those corners is colder than the other three. Now, if you walk around, you're going to find the cold spot. And I'm not going to tell you which one it is because it's in my book. But you could probably Google it. But I want you to experience it for yourself. I want you to go out there. I want you to walk around the corners and see if you can find the ghost that's standing on the corner of 20th and Washington. Now, see, someone did die near the corner of 20th and Washington. His name was Adrian Barstow. And on January 22nd, 1921, he was downtown in Lincoln. He was at the University Club. And he was there until about 11:15 p.m. on a Saturday night. And at the time, he talked to someone, a friend of his, and he said, hey, would you like me to give you a ride? And the friend was like, kind of drunk. And he was like, no, I'm going to get some food, because, that's what you do. And so he leaves his friend, and a few other people saw him as he was walking through the building. But there's a 45-minute gap in between the time that he leaves the University Club until he gets to 20th and Washington, where his home was. And the interesting thing is that it doesn't take 45 minutes to get anywhere from Lincoln, unless maybe it's a Husker Saturday, and you're stuck in traffic. But from downtown Lincoln to 20th and Washington should have taken a few minutes. So it takes him 45 minutes. No one ever knows where the 45 minutes went or where he was. And after parking in the driveway around midnight, he actually parks in the garage, and he comes up to the house. And as he's coming up to the house, someone inside the house, he lived with his parents and his siblings, and there was actually someone visiting at the time as well, heard him say, "Come out of there," or "Come out," as if he was yelling to someone who was outside. And then all of a sudden, bang, gunshot. And then they hear, "Help, help," and then bang, another gunshot. Well, what happened was that Adrian was walking up to his house, and there's two X's up there that are kind of small from the newspaper. And that's where he was standing. And what happened was he was shot in his stomach, the first shot, and then the second shot actually shot him in the eye, the left eye. And his sister came running out of the house. She heard the sound. And she came out, and he was standing near this area of the house, and she tried to help him, but he couldn't speak. And the ambulance is called, and as this is all going on, his mother, their mother, is looking out their second-story window, and she sees a man jump on a bike and ride across the lawn. And he's in an overcoat and a cap. Well, as this was all going on, the ambulance finally arrives, and they put Adrian in the ambulance, but he either dies in the ambulance or he dies on the way to the hospital. So he never is able to tell anyone who killed him. And according to police, the assailant actually crashed the bike near 19th and A Street, which is right up there, which is only a couple of blocks from where the Barstow home was. So what happened was there was a blood trail. So it led all the way to 19th and A Street, where they actually ended up finding a flashlight. A neighbor actually found the flashlight and then turned it in. And the blood trail led to 14th and M Street, where there's a large pool of blood, which would indicate that maybe they stopped. And then it trailed off after around North of O Street. And there were several witnesses involved in this. Several neighbors, someone saw someone standing in the entranceway with a bicycle. Someone saw someone running away, which could mean that there was another person involved. And then someone actually almost hit a man on a bike coming out of that area. So someone could have potentially hit the man who shot Adrian, but he got away. And all the witnesses had varying degrees of descriptions. 3 possible motives were provided: premeditated murder, someone was there to kill Adrian; a robbery just gone wrong. The flashlight was a big indicator for a really long time that maybe that might be something, but it never really led to anything. And then drugs. It was just someone on drugs. But they never found any motive. They never found any reason why anyone would want to kill Adrian. And no one was ever actually arrested for the crime, even though there was a lot of money put up at the time period in 1921 to get someone. And at first, they did believe it was a robbery, and they sort of switched back and forth between premeditated and robbery, but they never came to a solid conclusion. And the murder was never solved. So you have to think about all these elements of this story. You have to think about 2 shots fired out, which I think is incredibly important. The proximity of the actual crime and 20th and Washington. And just the fact that someone who was a young, eligible bachelor, who was Adrian Barstow, died on the corner. And is it Adrian on the corner now? I don't know. I want you to try to find out for yourself and let me know what you think. But I really want to know if you think it's colder. This is actually the house today. It's a very beautiful, large house, and that would be the driveway where he actually passed away. Now I'm going to get into the ghost stories of Wilderness Park. Wilderness Park has a very rich history. And one of the ghost stories associated with Wilderness Park is a train wreck. It was late 1800s, and a train is barreling down the tracks at a high rate of speed, and all of a sudden, it flies off the rails and crashes, consumes with fire, and everyone is pinned inside, and no one escapes from this. Well, they find out later that the derailment was not an accident. It was on purpose. And today, people can hear the screams of those people who were trapped inside that train around the area where it happened and throughout the woods. And they also can smell smoke and hear clanging metals and crashing sounds. And at night, they can see a figure running in the darkness with a glowing light like a lantern running from the scene. And most people, when they're walking near the bridge where this occurred, hear footsteps right behind them. And as they turn to try to find the person who's following them, no one's ever there. Now, the history of the train wreck has to do with the Rock Island train wreck. It was August 9th, 1894, and there was a locomotive on the way from Fairbury to Lincoln, and they left at 7:30, and they were set to arrive around 9:30. It had 33 passengers on board. Well, around 9:40 p.m., the train jumps the tracks and plummets 200 feet, or it travels 200 feet, and then plummets 40 feet below off of a trestle bridge. Well, the engine caught fire, and it killed the engineer and the fireman right away, and it consumed the cars. It consumed the cars on the wooden bridge. Now, several people tried to save the victims. There was a man named Harry Foote who actually went in several times. He had a broken leg. He was a brakeman, and he pulled out several people, but he couldn't save everyone. They actually found out later on that the fish plates were altered on the tracks, and someone had actually damaged the tracks with something, and they found a crowbar nearby. 11 people actually ended up dying from the wreck, and 15 more were seriously injured. The motive was just considered botched robbery attempt. There was only one person who was a suspect, and his name is George Washington Davis. Here's another image of the wreck. And George Washington Davis was arrested about 6 miles from the city on a farm. And he was supposedly seen around the scene the night of the wreckage. And when they found the trail, that the train tracks were actually altered, suspicion started to arise that maybe he was involved. Well, he claimed that he had come there after hearing about the wreckage from town. He was downtown at the time. And even though there were some discrepancies between his story, he never admitted to the crime, and he went through 2 trials. The first one, they could not come up with a verdict, and the second time, they actually convicted him of second-degree murder, and they charged him. They sentenced him to 20 years to life. But crazily, 10 years later, a governor named John Mickey actually released Davis based on lack of evidence, and then I never heard anything about him again. So if anybody knows anything about him, I would love to know where he went. This is actually the Rock Island train wreck site today. It's on Jamaica Trail North in Wilderness Park. This is one of my favorite stories because it's a witch tale. The Witch of Wilderness Park. According to legend, a witch lived in a house all alone inside the woods. And several children around 1900 started coming up missing. Can't find them anywhere. One day, a little girl is out near the woods with her sister, and all of a sudden, her brother is getting pulled into the woods by this witch that's out there. Well, she runs home, and she tells her parents. Well, the police come out, and they search the area. Well, they find a bunch of kids buried out there. But for some reason, they cannot blame her for the crime. They can't connect her to it at all. So, of course, the town starts spreading rumors, and they start building up a mob. And they go out to the woods, and they find the woman that lives alone in the woods, and they put a chain around her neck, and they hang her from a tree. Well, she's there for several days before she's found, and someone ends up burying her at the base of the tree. Well, today, if you can find that tree in Wilderness Park, it's linked to that chain, so all you have to do is follow it. But if you do, you're going to be cursed by the witch. Now, today, people say that they can hear chains rattling, ooh, spooky ghost. And they they hear gasping sounds as if someone's being choked, and children screaming for help. Well, at the time period, this is just a spooky bridge right here. At the time period that this story was taking place, Epworth Park was out in Wilderness Park. From 1897 to 1902, Epworth Park actually was run by the Epworth League of Methodist Church. And they were operating on the south edge, on the south side of Calvert Street, as in Lincoln Park at the time. And it was pretty lit up out there. It was also called Electric Park after that. And then eventually they moved over to the south side of Calvert, First and Calvert Street, into 200 acres. And they opened up Epworth Park around 1902. They charged 25 cents a day. They were open 7 days a week, and it was a place for people to just go, especially in the summertime, to spend the afternoon with their friends and family. And thousands of people went every single day because a train ran out there. Not hopefully the Rock Island train. There was two large amphitheaters. You see, there's lots of people in there. And they actually dug a donut-shaped lake, and people were on canoes, and they rode around. And there was tent bases. They actually had 857 wooden tent bases out there for people to stay overnight. And this, I think, is an important photo because there's a cabin in the middle of that lake. We'll talk about that in a little bit. There was actually a Boy Scout cabin in the center of the donut island. There were many buildings out there, and as I said, 857 wooden tent bases, and at least 100 buildings were built of either brick or wood. There was a 60-room dormitory, a 150-room hotel, 4 restaurants, a post office, a bookstore, a grocery store, and they could accommodate as many as 2,500 people. And lots of people stayed for 2 weeks at a time. It was like summer vacation. Many cabins were built on the property, and there were 12 or 15 families that lived there permanently all year round. They just loved it. That's probably where I would have been. Attendance, Salt Creek, it floods, as it does, and it did then too. And in 1930, attendance actually plummeted. There was only 14,000 people that showed up that year. And as the automobile became more popular, people just no longer had to spend the afternoons out in the woods, I guess. In 1935, there were 14 inches of rain over a period of several days, and that actually flooded the area, and it damaged a lot of the buildings. And in 1942, another flood came through, and they actually permanently decided that the health department said that you just can't have this out here anymore. It's not safe. 1966, the first time Wilderness Park was actually proposed, and Lancaster County actually bought the land in 1970. And in 1972, Wilderness Park became what it is today, which is over 1,400 acres. It's beautiful. It's spooky when it gets dark, but it's beautiful. And there's a lot of elements to this story. Rock Island, obviously, very similar. It's an eerie feeling out there, people say, out near the bridge. I mean, people died there. But the Witch of Wilderness Park is a little bit more difficult to pinpoint. I think the cabin is important because it was a Boy Scout cabin. And it was left there in 1972 after Wilderness Park actually became a park. And kids kept going out there for several years. And they eventually bulldozed it. So there was a foundation in a chimney. So people start maybe saying, hey, do you want to go out to the witch's cabin? And kids start telling ghost stories maybe around that time period. And so, you start to think that maybe these stories start to come out of kids. Or maybe from parents who are like, hey, don't go in the woods by yourself because a witch is going to get you. So, sometimes stories have very strong histories behind them. But then other times, maybe they are from fun stories that people pass down to each other. But there are woods out there, and there were cabins, and there were people that were out there. But a lot of children coming up missing can't really find that information. So sometimes they're fun tales. But I love the Witch of Wilderness Park story. Spring Ranch Bridge in Spring Ranch, Nebraska. The ghost story, Spring Ranch Bridge. In 1885, a woman named Elizabeth Taylor and Tom Jones, those are real people that are not famous outside of Spring Ranch, supposedly, maybe. Elizabeth Taylor and Tom Jones were hanged on the Spring Ranch Bridge. Taylor was known for causing tensions with her neighbors and for her cattle breaching fences and destroying crops. And after a man was murdered in town, she was accused of being involved. They said that she was running from the scene with a shotgun. Tired of dealing with Taylor, a mob was formed. And somehow her brother got roped in as well. and they drug her and her brother from home. They forced them out to the bridge, and they were hanged there. But as this was happening, Elizabeth cursed all of them in the mob, and she said, all of you involved will die tragically, and all of the people in your families will as well. Now, people today can see two ghostly apparitions swinging from the bridge. They can also see mist floating in the area, hear screams and gunshots, and choking sounds, and voices beneath the bridge as if people are conversing with each other. And people become ill when they're walking across the bridge. And people also experience malfunctions with their cars. They break down, their radios start going crazy. And there are reports of figures being seen running through the cemetery, shadows and voices in that area. Now, I chose this story about Spring Ranch because it's incredibly accurate to the history. It's almost exactly the same. So it's gonna sound like I'm sort of repeating myself, but I think it's important when we're talking about ghost stories to talk about the ones that actually have a lot of truth behind them. The history related to Spring Ranch, this is a photo of Spring Ranch from the Historical Society, and I just thought it was kind of cool. I mean, it's just from that area. In 1869, Elizabeth Jones married a man named James Taylor. And in 1872, they came along with the rest of the Jones family, and they moved to Clay County. And the Taylors purchased 80 acres of land, and just a little bit east of Spring Ranch at the time. They grew crops, and they raised cattle and hogs, and they were initially welcomed by the neighbors. They wanted to grow their town. But that didn't last long. Neighboring farmers complained about fences being destroyed by livestock. So their cattle were breaching fences and tearing up other neighbors' livestock. Their crops, sorry. And James, actually, her husband, actually just paid for it. He's like, I don't want to have problems with you guys. Here's some money. Money fixes lots of things. And Elizabeth wanted proof. She wanted proof that it was their cattle doing this. She didn't think it was them. So James eventually signs over the property rights to Elizabeth because she obviously knows what she's doing. She knows the business. She wants to deal with it. He don't want to deal with it. So he signs it over to her. So Elizabeth starts fighting for reparations for all the money that her husband paid out, which obviously causes problems with the neighbors. Well, as she's creating tension, in 1882, James Taylor dies. A fisherman on the Little Blue River sees him riding erratically on his horse, and all of a sudden he jumps off and he starts gulping water from the river. And before the fisherman can get to him, he's laying face down, dead. Well, everyone in town said Elizabeth did it. The reason why is because she had supposedly bought a large amount of Paris green beforehand, and it's an arsenic-based insecticide for potato bugs. Well, they didn't grow potatoes, not in large quantities, not enough to have a barrel of Paris green. So rumors spread that James died because he was poisoned. Well, then to add fuel to the fire, her father, John James, passed away within the next year in the summer. So, of course, she poisoned him too. She continued her feud with the neighbors, and after her fence was torn down, she had her boys actually go tear down the neighbor's fence. And her sons were arrested and caught and arrested. And the neighbor's sons were never questioned. And the Taylor family was actually rumored to also be cattle rustlers or talking about them all over the place. They were the only family in Spring Ranch that owned a shotgun, which I think is such a weird thing that they talk about all the time, that they are the only ones that own a shotgun. And 2 hired hands went missing, so she killed them too. And in 1884, Elizabeth allowed Edwin Roberts, a neighbor, to graze cattle on a piece of her land. And the land actually had a timber grant, so it was supposed to be used for timber, but she was not using it for timber, and no one else was. She was just allowing them to graze cattle. Well, Roberts was using it for timber. In January 8th, 1885, Elizabeth's sons, John and William, and a hired hand, actually see, not one of the dead ones, this is a new hired hand, sees Roberts and Joseph Byer go to graze their cattle on the land. And around 2 p.m., Roberts and Byer actually return with a wagon full of wood. The Taylor boys and the hired hand approach the wagon, and they accuse them of stealing. They start fighting with them. They're yelling at each other. And as this is going on, spooks the horses, and Joseph Byer, the man who was with Roberts, flies off. He had been sitting on top of the logs or something. And he flies off, and he's on the ground. Well, then one of the boys jumps out of the wagon, shoots Roberts, jumps back into the wagon, and all of them flee. Well, 3 neighbors supposedly witnessed this, and they found Roberts at the scene. His face had actually been, portion of his head had actually been blown off, and it was shown that it was a shotgun. Byer said that he actually saw one of the Taylor boys shoot Roberts, and another witness said the shooter was William. So they specifically said they saw William do it. The Taylor boys are arrested and they're jailed in Hastings, and rumors start to spread of Elizabeth running from the crime scene with a shotgun. Now, she's always running around with a shotgun. She's the only one in town that's got one. Well, rumors also start spreading about Tom Jones, which is interesting, because Tom Jones was known to be a nice guy around town. He was a Mason, he was friends with people, and other people in smaller towns knew him. And so people started saying that Tom was walking along the fence line with a shotgun and a shovel and a hired hand, and he walked down the fence line to check the fences, and he come back with the shotgun and the shovel, but no hired hand. So now he's poisoning people, right? On March 3rd, 1885, the first mob is formed. When no one exited the Taylor home, they just dispersed. They left. They tried to get him out. They're like, come on, get out of there. And they're like, no. So they leave. Well, the next night, the barn of the man accused of destroying Elizabeth's fences was burned down. Now, she probably did that one. I mean, let's be honest. On March 15th, 1885, a mob of around 15 or 25 men. You know, when you read about mobs from the past, they're always crazy numbers. Could have been 150, could have been 1. But they said about 15 to 25. They surrounded the Jones home where Elizabeth has been staying. Jones, actually, her brother had a sod house. She, according to reports, had a wooden framed house. So shooting through a sod house would be a little bit more difficult, I guess. So they were staying in his home. So they were obviously worried about the neighbors. They called out Tom and Elizabeth to come out of the home, but they responded by barricading the door. So, no. The mob actually starts threatening to throw dynamite down the chimney and through the window, so finally like, oh, all right, we'll come out. So there was actually like 9 people in the house at the time. I'm assuming this is a very big sod house. And 4 of them were people that worked for them, and another young boy who also worked for them, or 5. There was 5 men and a boy. And then their mother was also in the house, and Elizabeth's daughter, Maggie. She was around 5, I believe. They were all taken out of the house, and all of the men were tied up and taken to a guy's house. His name was Reese T. Reese. His name, first and last name, spelled exactly the same. Roberts, the man who was killed earlier, was also called Robert Roberts. They liked their names to be first and last the same. But Reese T. Reese, they had him at his house. All these guys. Well, they took Tom and Elizabeth and they tied them up with materials that they found from their home. And they took them out to a field near this bridge. And they told them that this was their trial. They were on trial for the murder of Edwin Roberts. Well, they of course said that they didn't do it, that they were innocent of the crime. And they were provided the time to pray. But they were going to be hanged for this offense. So Tom and Elizabeth are taken over to the bridge along the Little River. This is actually a bridge around that area today. It's not the same one. That one's been gone. But this is a modernized version of it. And they are taken over and they have nooses placed around their necks. Now there's 2 versions of this that come up. The first version is that they're taken to the edge and they're just shoved off. The second is that they're placed on horses, which is the most common story, and their gunshots are fired, which spooks the horses, leaving Tom and Elizabeth behind. And this is not Tom Jones or Elizabeth Taylor, but it is just to show just the gruesome nature of hangings around that time period. The bodies are not found until Sunday morning. A local person passes by and finds them. There's also reports that one of the men that was taken from their house actually saw them, and then had a bunch of other people come to make sure they witnessed the event, that they saw who was hanging there. And all the people who were reportedly involved in the mob were interviewed by police, but no one ratted each other out. And at first there was a lot of commotion. Maybe, these people are going to be convicted of this crime because a woman was killed. They killed a woman. She wasn't even there at the time when this murder happened. Her boys were there, but she wasn't there. And maybe she was involved, but she should have been given a trial. Well, as these things start coming out, time starts to pass, people start forgetting about that element, and they just start standing up for each other. The community sort of protected the mob, and 5 men were arrested, and Margaret Jones, who was Tom and Elizabeth's mother, who was in the house at the time, actually identified one of the men who came in after everything was over with to sort of check around. And even though she identified someone, he was never charged. After the hearings, during that time period, the court just protested, and then all 5 men were released as a result of lack of evidence. And Tom and Elizabeth were actually buried in Spring Ranch Cemetery. This is their gravestones. That is Tom and Elizabeth, and then that would be her husband, and then their parents were also there. And that's actually still there today. They had a top piece to them at one point, but, dang kids. So, yeah, that's the cemetery that people see figures, and those are their stones. And that is the story of Spring Ranch. Now, ghost stories have a way of evolving and changing, and Spring Ranch is important because a lot of the elements of the story are very similar. I mean, you even have her running around with this shotgun. It's 1885. The names are the same. Tom and Elizabeth. Those are the 2 people involved. Those are the 2 people in the story. It is Spring Ranch. It is a bridge. So there's a lot of elements of the story, even though it was so long ago that this happened, that people are still telling the story and they're still the same. So sometimes these stories are able to pass through time and continue to hold their history to them. And that's what was fun about writing my book, was that I had all these ghost stories to go through, and I had all of this history to delve into. And some of it, like the Witch of Wilderness Park, sometimes it's hard to find the information related to those stories. And sometimes it's a lot easier when it's something like Spring Ranch Bridge. But I tried to find places that I felt had incredibly good stories, but also history related to them that was worth sharing. And ghost stories are related to death. That's what you're getting. Someone has to die to be a ghost, for the most part. And so you're going to be delving into these histories that maybe aren't so nice all the time, but they're important to our communities. Elizabeth Taylor was a person. And whether or not she was poisoning everyone in town and running around with a shotgun is up for debate. But she was causing tensions with her neighbors according to what was actually going on at the time period. And, and she didn't deserve to die in that manner, but the history of their town is important because of those elements. And it also tells the story of their town as well. So combining all these together and trying to find out the truth behind the ghost stories has been an incredible journey. It's been very fun. It's been super fun since the C.C. White building when I was a kid. And I'm going to keep continuing to learn and share ghost stories, and that is my presentation today, and I hope that you all enjoyed it. So thank you so much for coming. If anyone has any questions, I'm welcome to answering them. Sure.
Do you know what happened to her kids?
That happened to her kids? I actually couldn't find out at first what happened to her kids, to Elizabeth Taylor's kids. And I'm actually starting to find out now that according to newspaper reports, which you have to kind of cross-check those with other information a lot of times, they didn't stay with, their mother died 9 years later. So she stayed in Spring Ranch and supposedly stayed in the sod house that Tom Jones had lived in. And she obviously, she was buried there. So she stayed behind, and I would assume that she would have stayed with the children. But it sounds like the 2 boys were actually in jail for 2 years after this. And they finally were released, John and William. And they never were charged with anything. No one was ever charged with the murder of Edwin Roberts. So no one was ever charged with the murder of their lynching, and no one was ever charged with his murder. But they actually went with an attorney, according to a report that I just recently saw. So I'm still kind of doing research as I go along because, sometimes you miss things and then sometimes you find new information or people share things. So it sounds like they were actually sort of taken to someone that she trusted. He had, the man that took them was a part of had taken care of her estate when she died. So it sounded like she trusted him and that's where they went. But I don't really know so much after they went to him. I don't really know what happened to them, but I would love to find out. Great question, thank you.
Sounds like you need
Yes,
a
Jess.
genealogist.
Yeah, it's fun delving through that stuff. Sometimes I ask them. I go to the genealogy, the places, and try to find out what I can. But sometimes only so much information you can get.
Did the curse work? Have you tried to see if the odd numbers died gruesomely?
She asked if the cursed worked from Elizabeth. I just recently found something that was related to someone had taken a piece of rope from the hanging and had actually returned it to the History Museum years later because they thought that it might change their luck. So it was a letter, they sent it in, and supposedly, I don't know 100% sure about this, but I've heard that there's actually a piece of rope still at the Clay County Museum. And I haven't seen it yet. It's kind of hard to get out there sometimes and, during the week and things like that, but I've heard that there's a piece of rope out there. But I don't know if they're cursed, because they ain't got it. So, I've looked in to see if maybe there was some weird deaths afterwards, but I didn't really find anything. So it would be interesting to find out. But I did find out that none of the people that were involved, supposedly, that were originally arrested, were in Spring Ranch by 1900. So within 15 years, they were all gone. So that I don't know if that either means dead or they just moved. So, yeah, interesting stuff.
Have you seen the chain at Wilderness Park?
She asked if I've seen the chain at Wilderness Park. I have not seen a chain at Wilderness Park, but Wilderness Park is huge. So, I mean, if there's a chain somewhere, if I found a chain, I would probably not touch it. Let's be honest. I don't want to be returning it someday and saying hopefully it'll change my luck, I've never seen a chain, but there could potentially be a chain. So there's a lot of things going on around there at that time. But it would probably at this point be pretty buried underneath things if there are chains still out there on the ground somewhere. But they probably used chains at some point while people were camping out there and doing things, and so it could be. Is anyone else? Sure, go ahead.
Have you ever seen Clara Mills' ghost?
Have I ever seen Clara Mills' ghost? I have not seen Clara Mills' ghost. But CCY building's been gone since before I was born. So I really wish I could have seen it. But I know there's an administration building out there now. So have you seen Clara Mills' ghost?
There's people on that campus who claim they have.
Right. Yeah, and I still hear people talk about it today that they know she's there and they sense she's there, and hopefully it's positive energy. She was supposedly a great teacher and she worked hard and people liked her, so I can imagine that maybe she enjoys being there. So yeah, if you ever see her, let me know.
I'll call you.
Does anyone else have any questions?
Do you have more stories that you're researching currently?
I do have more stories that I'm researching. I'm always researching stories. For this book, I chose locations that were public, that you could go to, for, as long as you're not, no one should be ruining anything, obviously. But I picked locations where people could visit them. They could check them out for themselves, They're places that they're not open to the public. And so I've been also trying to find, I'm always open to writing another book related to the same things, and it would be new stories and new locations, and I'm always searching and trying to find more. So yeah, I actually have 10 that I really like right now, but I'm also researching a lot of the stories. Especially doing things like this, it makes you kind of want to go back through a lot of the articles. So there might be some newer additions to the book later on down the line too as well. So Anybody else? Does anybody think this place is haunted? No, go ahead.
Are you currently writing a book?
I am not currently writing a book, but I'm currently always researching a book. I do a lot. The process that I tried to take, especially with this book, was to sort of take the ghost stories, really get into them, try to get as many people as I could to tell me their versions of the ghost stories, because lots of people have versions of ghost stories. That's what's great about them. Lots of people experience different things in the same areas. And so I tried to hear as many versions as I could of the ghost stories, and then I sort of tore them apart, piece by piece, trying to get the elements out of them that I felt I could run with. And then I did a lot of research. I did a lot of newspaper articles and, genealogy, and, I was going to these locations, and, so it's a lot of work in between before getting there. But yes, I'm hoping that the stuff that I'm actually doing now will lead to another book. So thank you.
What about the Bloody Mary story north of town? Did you come
I-
across anything?
I wrote about Bloody Mary in my book. I tried to do a different sort of take than maybe previously done. I didn't want my book to be the same as what everyone else has been doing. But I tried to really sort of, her story is legendary, she's a legend. But she was also a very good person. So I tried to sort of share that element of her life and who she was. So yeah, I have been out there, and, the house is no longer there, so it's kind of hard to figure out where exactly everything was. But I've heard lots of stories from people who grew up around here being out there, though. So but it's an incredible story. It's one of my favorites, and I love it because my cousin, who's like 15, is like, "Have you heard about Bloody Mary?" And I'm like, "That's so awesome that you're 15." And then they're still telling these stories to each other, So I love it. I love that it's sort of stayed over time. Well, if that's it, I will be out there. If anyone else wants to personally just ask me a question you don't want to ask in front of everyone else, I would love to answer that for you. But thank you so much for coming out and listening to me today. I hope you're spooked a little bit.